Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to the Royal Society of Medicine's In Conversation series. Now, we've done 89 In Conversation since we kicked off nearly 2 years ago. And our first guest was the journalist Evan Davis, presenter of Newsnight at that time and now, PM. And we started the program by talking about the big events of the day, which was COVID, and we agreed it was pretty scary, I think. And we went on to talk about COVID for the whole of the program. Now, I've just listened to Evan presenting PM in his usual style when he described the current situation as very scary, not even pretty, and his voice actually was rather different to what it had been 2 years ago. So it's good to welcome today another great journalist, Fraser Nelson, editor of the Spectator. And Fraser, for the first time since we had Evan on 2 years ago, we're going to start with something that isn't COVID, but it's definitely rather more than pretty scary. Obviously, it's the Ukraine. I don't know quite how to begin. Your deputy editor wrote today, Isabel Harman, she talked about how the whole house today, as you all saw, rose to applaud the Ukrainian ambassador. But even she said hard-bitten, cynical journalists who are paid never to applaud were on their feet as they were today. This is different, isn't it?
Oh, this is just an incredible story. It's, journalists aren't supposed to take sides. We're never supposed to applaud or anything like that. But here, it is rare we can find something so absolutely unequivocal that can be no doubt in any decent person's mind. Not just whose side to be on, but just how strongly that the Ukrainians deserve our support. And this, of course, is, Britain, to be honest, Boris Johnson, I think, has actually been on the front foot here quite a lot. We were one of the first countries to realize how serious things were and to get those 2,000 anti-tank missiles to Ukraine at a time where other countries weren't so sure. What I think we could do a lot more now is, of course, take in the refugees. We are not being particularly generous compared to the rest of Europe in taking in those Ukrainian passports. Something like 600,000 are on the move. I think in the next few days, we're just going to see that humanitarian crisis unfold. We've got a piece in the Spectator tomorrow by Nick Robinson about how he was presenting the Today program from Kiev and just how difficult he found it getting back from Kiev to the Polish border, people he met there, the scenes he saw, just what it looks like when you evacuate an entire city. So I think the news from Ukraine is gripping, it's horrific. And I think it's just going to be more so in the coming days and weeks.
I think it's 900,000 according to tonight, I think.
Wow.
Obviously, it's gathering pace. And you have certainly written yourself much on that subject of our refugee policy, and that's right. I mean, you and I both in the past are quite Russophile, great admirers of its people, which is fair enough, and its culture and so on and so forth. And of course, the same is true of the Ukraine, that these Ukraine and Russia are not aliens to each other. They're not from other planets. They are linked in many, many ways. Is that not the case?
Yeah, of course. I mean, these are two countries that are basically family, more like Britain and Ireland. And this is why I think I was looking at the Russian media today, and I'm struck by how little Putin wants to admit to his own people about what's going on here. Probably because he knows they would be appalled to think of Russian missiles shelling Kiev. This is a country where they've got family, friends, they go on holiday there, completely interlinked. And the idea that Russia should be the ones assailing Ukraine is something that, it is something, it just boggles the minds to think that there are now 40 miles worth of Russian tanks on their way to Kiev. And also to think that we will yet again see Russian tanks invading a European capital. I mean, something we've also got in common, you and I, Simon, as well as our love of Russia, is that we've also got family links to Czechoslovakia. My wife's family were refugees who fled Prague when the tanks rolled in there in 1968. And it was their turn to be amongst the refugees, trying to look for a country that would give them shelter. They went to Sweden, and Sweden gave them everything. And it's funny that at home I've got these books, these picture books of 1968, Prague Spring and the invasion, to try to tell my kids that this sort of thing did happen. But their family story is a refugee story, not on my side, but on their mothers. Because I was worried that might grow up they might grow up just not being able to imagine what it was like to have a European capital invaded by Russian tanks. And yet we see exactly this being replayed in Ukraine now. We see tens of thousands of people on the move yet again, the unimaginable happening. But there's a big difference this time, of course, is that in 1968, the West looked on thinking, well, there's nothing we can do. Now we do think there are things that we can do. We are actively coming to the aid of Ukrainians, and we're doing everything. And of course, in Ukraine, they've got this incredible president whose courage and whose eloquence has done so much to, I think, rally the West to his side, to persuade countries like Germany to get off the fence and come firmly with the rest of Europe in backing Ukraine. So it's very different to 68, but still some horrible parallels, which I really never thought I would live to see again.
If I'd known you were going to mention that, I've got a scrapbook of Czechoslovakia 68 as well, because I was there as a 10-year-old and with my parents. And so I've also seen the front end of a Russian tank. I thought it was terribly exciting. My parents are obviously terrified witless. But yeah, you're right. And you're the one who told me Zelensky is an extraordinary character. You said he'd won the Ukrainian Strictly. That's true? Is it?
Oh my God, he is a man of so many achievements. Not only did he win their equivalent of Strictly Come Dancing, but he then he played this. He played the part of an average school teacher. He was an actor. And the role he had was being an average school teacher who got so angry with politicians that he ranted to a colleague. It was filmed, it went viral, and the school teacher became the president to much acclaim. And of course, you've got life imitating art here with exactly the same trajectory. And he also gave the voiceover for, I think, Paddington Bear 2, amongst his other accolades. And he's the sort of guy who, a few months ago, you might have written him off as a bit of a spiv, a bit of an actor trying his hand at politics. But then look at a bit like Reagan, I suppose, he would have had the same sort of derision. But look at the speeches he's given now, speaking in Russian, addressing himself to the Russian people, bravery, the kind of leadership. This is political leadership on a scale that we very, very seldom see from somebody who is the opposite to a professional politician. And I do, rather than not understand what happened in the Czech Republic, my kids are now gripped to it. They're gripped seeing the children in the refugee lines now, thinking that could have been them. But also they've got a new hero in this incredible Ukrainian president. My kids, they're age of 8, 10 and 12, and they're watching his videos in translation, and even they are feeling inspired by it. So I think, cometh the hour, cometh the man. And Ukraine has found a champion that is literally rallying the world. And people are marching on capitals around the world in support of Ukraine, in large part because of what they hear from its incredible president.
Yes, the parallel, my son is, I can say this now, because people know this, he's called Alexander, but he's named after Alexander Dubček. So, and I was at the same age as your children are now in Prague in 68. And we should just emphasize Zelensky's first language is Russian, and I don't understand Russian, but I did read the translation of his appeal to the Russian people, which is as moving as the rhetoric of Churchill in 1940, except of course it's aimed to the people whose leader is invading them. And you can't imagine Churchill making a moving plea to the German people in 1940. His French was actual, he had no German at all. But Zelensky's mother tongue is Russian, and he's clearly very proud, rightly so, of his grandfather, who fought with courage and distinction in the Red Army during the Patriotic War. It's almost painful to think about, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. He was saying in that speech how absurd it was that Putin is describing the Ukrainian regime as a Nazi regime. And he was saying, let's set aside the fact that Zelensky is Jewish. He is, he's got a family who fought off the Nazis. The sacrifices they made in Ukraine are just an absolutely incredible scale. And in fact, it was one of the areas that the Russians had bombed was the memorial to the Jews who died at the hands of Nazis in Ukraine.
Yes, Babi Yar.
Yeah. And so he's able, that speech, you're completely right, Simon. When I saw it, I thought this was incredible. We got a translation done and we put it on the Spectator website, making it free to read. And it was the most read thing that we've had all week. I mean, people reading it, it's just, as you so rightly say, this is, it is impossible to read this and not be moved almost to tears by just what's at stake, but also how well he's able to articulate it. I very much doubt, by the way, that Putin imagined this when he took Ukraine when he took Crimea in 2014. That was very, very quiet, very, very quick. Men in black suits. In fact, the Crimeans were told not to resist, because if they did, that would give the Russians an excuse to fight back. So I imagine, especially given how divided the West seemed to be a few weeks ago, that Putin probably thought this would be quite straightforward, but obviously miscalculated, not just on the courage of Zelensky, but the courage of your average Ukrainian. What we've seen inside these civilian fighters taking up arms, it's just been incredible. And also it makes you think that if the worst happens and Kiev does fall, then the odds are that Putin will be in for quite a long guerrilla campaign, because this is now a country which is pretty well armed with thousands of anti-tank missiles sent in, not just from Britain, but Sweden, of all countries, has agreed to send in 5,000 anti-tank missiles. The first time Sweden's done anything like this for about 70 years. And so there will be no end of munitions. And I can't see this, if Putin, obviously, if he's got 40 miles worth of tanks, he's got the force to take Kiev if he wants. But if he does, I think it will be a very long war, and something which I hate to say, I think is going to be in our headlines for some time to come.
Yeah. I mean, the other, possibly even more surprising than the Swedes, is the Germans, who you wouldn't reversed what's his 77 years, isn't it, of, from their basic law, of supplying, not medical supplies, which they've certainly done before, but supplying arms to another country. I think, is that not unique as well?
Oh yeah, it's absolutely stunning. The change which has taken place in German politics in the last week is as great as has happened probably in the last few decades. We've got a piece from Wolfgang Munchau in the Spectator tomorrow saying it's the biggest change he's seen in his lifetime. So not only do you have Germany saying it's going to spend 100 billion euros more on defense, going up to 2%, but that's not even controversial. It is backed by 78% of Germans. Now that is as much support as you get in a democracy for anything. So not only do you get a radical shift in policy, which flies in the face of everything that has been the German political consensus for the last few decades, but is one which is immediately backed by public opinion. And we had this peace march in Berlin on Sunday. And that was that was incredible. It wasn't the normal German pacifist. You had signs there saying, better a cold shower than Putin's gas. You had this, it was turned into a march of resistance and defiance in Putin, which made Olaf Scholz, a left-wing chancellor, basically come up with things which the right couldn't do, didn't dare to call for a long, long time. So you're seeing now old certainties swept away immediately. You're seeing in Finland, you're seeing a majority of Finns now want to join NATO, 55%. I never thought I'd live to see that either. And the debate in Sweden is now the case where I think 4 political parties now want to join NATO. And even Switzerland, neutral during the Second World War, is backing now the sanctions against Putin. So you're finding a West which in some ways is more united now than at any time in living memory. And by the way, West doesn't even cover it, because you've got Japan, you've got South Korea also coming in behind these sanctions, because they know that China is watching this too and wants to know what happens to countries who invade their neighbor. So we're getting not just the West, but Asia, and this incredible unity coming together in a way that was literally unimaginable only 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. So we really are truly living in historical times.
Yeah. And Wolfgang Munchau, he correctly predicted in your magazine 10 days ago that sanctions weren't going to stop Putin. But I still think he was taken aback by actually what did happen, wasn't he?
You bet.
I read that.
Because Wolfgang at one point was openly speculating that Germany would not take sides, because Germany was so addicted to Russian gas. This was Wolfgang's great concern, that all of these energy decisions that Germany taken to abolish nuclear so quickly, to go ahead with Nord Stream 2 pipeline, that would have massively increased its reliance on Russian gas. But these had basically economically bound Germany's hands. so it could simply not join the rest of Europe in any anti-Russia maneuvers. And Wolfgang himself says just how wrong he proved to be. They've now dumped Nord Stream 2, which took years and tens of billions of dollars to create. It's now dumped, and all of these things have happened. And so his fears in that regard have not been realized, although he does make the point that Germany still has to work out where else it's going to get its gas from. It hasn't worked that out yet. So the rhetoric is aligned with the rest of the West, but Germany has got some pretty big decisions, especially when it comes to working out what really are the alternatives to the gas. And Germany's got, for example, its economic policy is based on the idea of its companies being able to get reasonably cheap energy to export to the world. Germany loves its balance of payment surplus. Is it going to abolish that too? Lots of hugely important decisions ahead.
Of course, they closed all their nuclear power stations, didn't they? Very dramatically.
Yeah, but they had said they'd phase it out by the end of the decade.
Okay.
But now the Greens are beginning to backtrack even on that. So it's interesting. And you're finding these, the Greens are actually surprisingly hawkish on this and willing to accept, I think, the tension between their no nuclear policy and their reluctance to be reliant on Russian gas.
Okay, so just in the last 2 years, everybody has become an armchair epidemiologist, and now, of course, very rapidly, everyone is becoming an armchair general again. But they had a real general on PM this evening. It was David Richards, who was pretty scary about talking about the chances of the risks of nuclear conflict. But he also, I think it was him, who quoted a well-known quote about it's Sun Tzu, from 500 BC, who said, always leave a bridge for your enemy to retreat across. I think he actually used the phrase golden bridge. Do you think there is any way that Putin can get out of this? Is there a golden bridge left for him to go across?
Well, I actually think that there is. I mean, we were talking earlier about what the Russians are being told. We're not being told this is an exercise to capture Kiev. We're not being told this is to depose its government. They're being told that this is simply some special operations, some special maneuvers to protect the apparently beleaguered Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Now, that does allow him the narrative to say, well, the special operation is finished. The Ukrainians have agreed not to shell the people in the east, not that they're doing so anyway in the first place, but you can imagine Putin spinning such a line to his own people. We've achieved our objectives, and now we're going to go back to what it was before. Now that is, of course, but this is, I'm not saying this is probable, I'm just saying it's possible.
Yeah.
Because I really don't think those around Putin, or rather at the opposite end of his very long table, you get the impression that they're not particularly trusting of his judgment here, and they would not have imagined the West would have been so united. I imagine they'll have been just as shocked as Wolfgang Monschau at the German turn of events, and to see Sweden and Finland think about joining NATO. So you end up with a NATO that had been almost falling apart through disuse, and you've ended up galvanizing the very institution that you're trying to undermine in the first place. So you can certainly see them thinking, look, none of this serves our strategic objectives, and is it all worth it? And there still is a get out, because Putin, to this day, he says he doesn't want to depose Ukraine. He wants to, I think he used the word demilitarize. Of course, what's the difference between that and disarming a government? But I still do think that golden bridge of retreat is still standing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's hope so. Let's hope so. Now let's we have to move into segue into British politics a little bit. And when I was starting to think about what we would be talking about, I have to say, I never thought we'd have gone 20, 25 minutes without mentioning the word Boris, but we have. But still linked to the Ukraine, what's your view? You obviously, this is, you're a PhD in Boris studies, like every journalist is, particularly at the Spectator, as he was one of your predecessors. Where do you think then this has left Boris?
Well, I think he's in a far better place than he was a few weeks ago. We've got another piece in the magazine this week by Rod Liddell, who's called for Boris to go, who says that he thinks Boris is probably safe now, that the world events have changed so much, that all of a sudden, who had a drink where in Downing Street seems a fairly trivial matter compared to what's in front of us in Europe, and the fact that Britain seems to so far have done as much as is reasonably possible. We haven't entertained a no-fly zone, so we haven't gone too far either. So I think that right now, it's funny how many covers we recently ran at the Spectator asking if Boris could survive. And I remember twice we had to junk our covers within 2 or 3 hours notice because things changed so much. It did seem as if he was really on the edge here, but his party was thinking, look, this guy's popularity has collapsed and it's not coming back. And Tories are usually quite ruthless people. If Prime Minister isn't going to help them win the next election, they get rid of him and let's get the new Prime Minister along. And the Red Wall Tory MPs, they had pretty much lost confidence in him. The 2019 intake, overlapping but not entirely the same group, we're also having meetings saying something needs to be done. And it seemed basically, to me, Munira Mirza's resignation is one of the most significant things, not to the rest of the world, but she was his head of policy, a real Boris believer. I've been in a room with her where she'd be arguing Boris's merits against a whole bunch of others who thought Boris was a bozo who shouldn't be in the job. Now, even she is walking out thinking, you know what, we got the wrong guy, he's not up to it. That was a pretty big sign to me that what the best part of Boris, mainly his ability to assemble great people around him, that he'd begun to lose that. Great people had begun to quit. And I can't think of many times in British politics where these reboots are successful. You lose one whole bunch of staffers, you get in another staff, and then all of a sudden it launches. Now, normally you get an original bunch of staff. They make a success or they don't. And if they don't, then usually you're shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. Now, I'm not going to say that's a position that Boris Johnson's in yet, but I do know that in British politics, popularity tends to be a zigzaggy sort of graph going downwards, not upwards. Yeah. And right now, his popularity rating, the last time I looked, it was lower than any British Prime Minister since John Major at his nadir. And I'm struggling to see how that recovers. But then again, Boris is the master of political escapes, and he might have one big escape still left in him.
Yeah. Although, I mean, I did anticipate going in a slightly different direction because obviously none of us anticipated events. You have been charting his decline for a long time. And in particular, in November 2021, that's 4 or 5 months ago, I think it was actually on Channel 4 there, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But you said you said that Tories now finally had enough of accident-prone Johnson. So you actually said that he is accident-prone, whereas in fact, is he not closer to one of Napoleon's marshals now? Who, Napoleon always said, what do you want from your marshals? He says, oh, they don't need to be great generals, but they need to be lucky.
Oh yes, and he is nothing if not lucky.
Yeah.
I mean, he always he defies gravity in this way, always has done, which is why I would put nothing beyond him. And the great scale of journalistic opinion about Boris, I'm probably in the most optimistic quadrille. That I still think he's got this magical quality that defies all sorts of rational prediction. He's got this connection with the public that still a Liz Truss figure would struggle to emulate. And then you need to ask yourself, if not Boris, who do you think is going to come along and do a better job than him at winning voters in the Red Wall or the various things that he's got ahead of him? Do we really think that Rishi Sunak is that chap? I'm a fan of Rishi Sunak, but I struggle to think how he would do that much better in the Red Wall than Boris Johnson. Do we think Liz Truss is the answer if Boris Johnson is the problem? Do we think it's time for Jeremy Hunt? When you start to go down that road, you start to see the quandary that the Tory party have got. They might not like Boris Johnson. They might be in despair at all of his accident-prone things, but do they really want to go through the agony of deposing somebody who was elected with a fairly big democratic mandate in 2019, a very personal mandate as well?
So Angela Burnett has just asking, she said the issue about Johnson is rather that he's a compulsive liar and totally untrustworthy. I agree with you, this has been overtaken by the Ukraine, but the question is this, is there really no memory amongst voters?
There is forgiveness amongst voters, and there also is the least bad the least bad option amongst voters. That's the other thing. Very few voters leave the polling booth with their heart aflame, delighted with the choice that they've just gone for. Usually it's an ugly baby competition, really, and they go for the least bad option. So yes, you might. By the way, I wouldn't quite share that assessment of Boris Johnson. I mean, people were saying that before 2019, and millions of people still, nonetheless, voted for him. The question is whether you think he'd be better off than Keir Starmer. It's always a choice right now.
Well, several of your very distinguished colleagues at the Spectator, and you will know the names as well as I do, not to mention the Telegraph, including many editors of the Telegraph, have said exactly that about Boris, though. So you can't pretend that's not true, Fraser.
I know that lots of people say that. It is not an analysis that I share.
Fair enough.
But certainly, I would reckon that about a third of the country would probably agree with that, perhaps more. I mean, you see what my former colleague Peter Reborn has literally written a book about the lies of Boris Johnson. So I completely accept that's one of the critiques. And by the way, there are so many other reasons which you get fed up with him. From a conservative point of view, you could say, what's the point of a conservative prime minister who raises taxes to a 71-year high? In what way is that conservative? Look at the policies of lockdown and all of the cost that inflicted on the country. You know, there are so many reasons to have had enough of Boris Johnson if you're a Tory MP, or even if you're not right now. But still, in spite of all of this, Labour is a little bit ahead of him in the polls, but nowhere near as much as you would expect, given everything that Boris and the Tories have been through.
And also, just to needle very, very slightly, when Michael Gove asked for forgiveness for the Partygate, etc., you were quite critical of that. You said it's not for the whatever Gove was, Chancellor, to ask for forgiveness for what you yourself said were pretty. I mean, I know in context now they don't seem so bad, but you weren't very much keen on forgiveness back then, and that was only a few weeks ago.
Look, I'm a Christian. I'm a complete believer in the notion of forgiveness, but when it comes to politics, I think that politicians who set the rules cannot expect political forgiveness from the voters if they violate those own rules. This is why I think Partygate is so damaging, because it was the people inside Number 10, and by the way, people like Michael Gove, who always was on the most restrictive side for when it came to lockdown discussions. Michael Gove was always the one arguing for the maximum restrictions. So for people like, by the way, I've got no idea, he might have led a blameless life during lockdown. But Number 10, if you were saying people, couldn't go to their own, people had to limit who went to funerals, you couldn't go visit your neighbor during lockdown, and when you find out the guys implementing those rules were violating them, I think you can expect a political punishment. On a personal level, of course, I would advocate forgiveness. That's what I do. And on a political level, you could think, well, no, it's actually time for somebody else, because lawmakers cannot really be law breakers, especially when it comes to a policy like lockdown, which costs so much collateral damage to society, to the economy, and to public health.
Fair enough. Now I wanted to go, and I think I'll probably do that a little bit later on, actually, because we've segued now into COVID, and there's just a couple of things, we want to talk about with you. One, which attracted a lot of attention from people in my trade of epidemiology and all that kind of stuff. You had a bit of a Barney with Graham Medley, who of course has been on this program as well, who's a well-known modeler, a distinguished scientist. And you had a bit of a Barney with him. What was all that about?
It was about, I was simply trying to ask him what these SAGE forecasts were supposed to be. We were on the point of being locked down for a fourth time as a country. His group, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, had come out with some really hair-raising models showing vast numbers of deaths, which proved to be way, way out of kilter with what we would suggest from South African data. Now, I am no scientist, but what I wanted to ask him was why, on what basis was he publishing these things? Of course, you can easily grab the headlines and say that tens of thousands of people are going to be killed but by this new wave of COVID. But I was also struck that JP Morgan, a merchant bank, has come up with another forecast saying that hospitalizations are going to peak out at about 2,500. So what I wanted to know was, why wouldn't he include that scenario? And by the way, JP Morgan was more accurate than any single Sage forecast when it came to Omicron. And as a journalist, I'm just curious, like, why should it be that a bunch of bankers should get it right when professional epidemiologists were getting it wrong? Now, like, can I just say here that I do not for a second question the professional integrity of Professor Medley or the rest of them. I wanted to know his remit. I suspected that he was being asked to come up with some, let's face it, scary scenarios that would have modeled not what they thought was going to happen, but they were, scenarios rather than predictions. That's what he kept saying. But that is, again, that's not enough. When you think of what's at stake here, liberty, public health, all sorts of things, we need to know on what basis were those scenarios published? Why would you publish one scenario and not the other? And why was it that every single Sage scenario turned out to be worse than the actual outcome? Now, he was in front of a select committee today, Professor Medley, being asked
was he? Okay.
questions. Yeah, he was. And the politicians are trying to get to the back of this. Like, what is Sage? It's being presented to us as scientific advice given to the government. But in his Twitter exchange with me, Professor Medley was saying, we only model what we're asked to model. Asked by whom? There's a kind of what I call black box democracy here, where we're not told. It's not the fault of the scientists who are being thrust into the public limelight without any sort of support. I think politicians hide behind scientists in this regard. They want to make a decision and make out that it's come down in a commandment from the medics in Mount Sinai. But I was just trying to get to the heart of what has effectively governed us for the last 2 years. The Sage Committee operating in very shady circumstances, not really open to scrutiny. And although I'm no medic, I am a journalist, and what journalists are supposed to do is do our best to ask questions of those in power. And I was delighted via Twitter to have the chance to ask Professor Medley by the way, I'm not quite sure I quite understood his answers, but his answers certainly seemed to lead politicians to think that Sage was not the prediction which others were saying that it was.
I mean, we had two things to say. I was on Sage, but it was some years ago when you weren't even allowed to say that Sage existed, let alone go on the media and talk about it. But then it was secret. But now, of course, firstly, I'm quite certain that they'll all be saying, Simon, tell them that we publish our minutes, we publish our instructions and all that stuff, which they do.
I do.
And they're nothing like as lurid as you might say. But the real question I want to say is that in their predictions, they always have, as you see in going at breakneck speed on ads on TV, it always, for insurance, it always says terms and conditions apply. And but if you're asked to model, well, what's the worst thing that can happen, which is a reasonable thing for government to ask, you then do what you've been asked to do. Is that really so bad?
Oh, again, I don't blame the modelers at all. But what I do say to you is I think Patrick Vallance retorted that they had like 10 different scenarios, probably more than that. And again, why was it every single one of those scenarios was worse than actual? What does that say about the assumptions being programmed in here? And why was it that a merchant bank using the real world South African data was able to predict Britain right? I mean, Sage, these are brilliant scientists. We've got some of the best universities, the best scientists, the best medics in the world in this country. And yet something had gone very badly wrong, where the services of these brilliant people were being deployed into a Sage document, which through its lack of transparency was being used to suggest that the hospitalizations and the deaths would be by an order of magnitude worse than turned out to be the case from Omicron. So that seems to me to be an abuse of science. And what worries me is that next time there's a new variant or even a new pathogen, then Sage won't carry as much weight because people will think it cried wolf first time around. My suspicion is there has been political abuse of scientists, political abuse of Sage, and that somewhere in that process, what was being presented to the cabinet and to the country was something far removed from what you might regard as the best predictions of honest scientists.
Well, except that you're always contradicting yourself slightly. The general rule for scientific advice, the government is there to advise. They don't make the rules. They should be on tap, not on top, in Churchill's favorite phrase, etc. And isn't that finally exactly what did happen, in the sense that, in fact, the cabinet didn't follow some of the sage advice in that area, and they don't give advice. They just say, this is what might happen with these set of circumstances. But the final thing is, where I would disagree with you, is that, in fact, the system worked. Finally, it is always a political decision as to what happens. They've also got to balance things that SAGE can't model, because it's not set up to do that. The economy, mental health, they can't model schools and all of those things, but government has to take those into account. That actually the system worked rather well, didn't it? Fraser, your doomsday scenario didn't happen.
Oh my God, how I wish I agreed with you, Simon. If you basically compare our outcomes to those of Sweden, when you look at things like cancer diagnosis, for example, the hit we took in this country, the hit we took for elective operations, down by 50% here, where the Danes managed to increase theirs. But let's go back to the system. Take Graham Medley, who I admire very much. He made a very good point in front of the committee today. He said that he always assumed the SAGE would feed up its assumptions, and there'd be somebody else modeling the economic, the social impacts of lockdown and coming to a decision. In fact, to his shock, nobody was modeling the wider public health implications, the impact on cancer care, the impact on education, as you mentioned. None of that modeling took place. Now, that wasn't Graham Medley's fault. It wasn't the fault of anybody on SAGE. This was the government's fault, because the system didn't work. What should have happened was that SAGE should have fed into another committee that would have commissioned social and economic advice, and then you'd have a full spectrum picture on which policymakers can make a decision. That's what happened in Sweden, and it didn't happen in this country. And there was a very big imbalance. And I think it's completely wrong to blame the scientists for this. They never asked to be the only ones doing the modeling, but that's how it worked out.
I mean, that's Gus O'Donnell on this program, on the series, made exactly the same point as to why weren't there economists on SAGE, actually. But although it's not set up to do that, but I think that's a very good point. Why weren't similar models taking place of the other issues as well? In the interests of fairness to epidemiologists around the world, you're right that Sweden has had better outcomes than we have, although they've just finished their inquiry, which is quite critical of their early response. It said it could have been better. It messed up the care homes as much as we did and things like that. But it's also striking that countries that seem similar, Finland, you mentioned earlier in a different context, Norway, Denmark, did much better than Sweden. And you would think that those four countries, because they're so similar in many other respects, ought to have had similar outcomes, but they most definitely didn't.
No, they didn't, but I've always had a bit of a problem with the Sweden versus its neighbours argument. You have to remember that, in fact, a very good piece of work done in Bristol University was showing just how different countries are when it comes to COVID vulnerability. You need to look at population density. I mean, what matters is how close people are together, not how many trees there are between the cities. And Sweden as a country is actually more urbanized even than Britain, way more urbanized than is more urbanized than Germany, and Norway is way less. So these countries, they might be roughly the same position on the map, but as a society, they're different. On globalization, they're different. And when you look at the initial COVID hit they had before anybody locked down, Sweden already, for whatever reason, had it a lot worse. Now, by the way, Sweden, no country has got a COVID success story. The only story any of us have got are varying degrees of failure. But what Sweden did was something fundamentally important. It thought that it would have a voluntary lockdown. In other words, it recognized that people in a high information democracy will work from home themselves. The Swedes at one point were working from home more than anybody else in the whole of Europe. So you don't need to send the police after dog walkers. You don't need to make it illegal to carry out basic acts of kindness to your neighbors, to go in and look after your friend. If your friend's got cancer, you can look after her kids. You could I'll confess to you that I did something like that. I broke the law in doing so. I should not have, at what point does it become illegal to look after the kids of a friend of yours who've been diagnosed with cancer? I mean, we should never have been put in that position, and we needn't have been. And I really hope that when the dust settles on this, when you all look around the things which people did and didn't do over lockdown, we recognize that the big thing we underestimated was just how responsible people can be if left to themselves.
I think that's a very fair point. But to echo, when we had an expert on policing program, he also did point out that the cases you mentioned, which are all true, of course, but were very, very exceptional. In the end, we had a very light touch policing. You're praying like the Swiss, you didn't need any policing at all. But it was very light touch. We can't claim that we lived in a fascist state for the last 2 years. I mean, you're not saying that, but
no, I'm certainly not saying that. But what I am saying,
I know you're not. Yeah.
But right now, only a few hours ago today, a beggar was fined hundreds of pounds for breaking lockdown laws by begging. I think £91,000 was imposed. These cases are still going on. Now,
really?
Yeah,
no, I didn't know that. Okay.
No, they are. It is. If you have a look, there was a course today where this policeman was saying how he arrested a beggar who was violating coronavirus laws. Obviously, a beggar doesn't have that much money to be fined hundreds of pounds. Really, where's the humanity in that? We're at a system now where where no longer care home workers, for example, are no longer required to be vaccinated. That's been rescinded. The courts are still prosecuting people for what happened during lockdown. And I think that was it was deeply unnecessary, and it criminalized basic human behavior. I think the people of this country could really be trusted to take care, and most important, to take care of each other. That was so important, and people were not able to do that, or rather they felt they'd be breaking the law if they were to do that during lockdown. And I think it's really important that we learn these lessons so we never, ever repeat that again.
I certainly think that is true. Yeah, on the funerals and visiting relatives, I just think you're right there. Now, people do want to talk a bit more about you and the world of journalism, etc. Now, Spectator, as well as being, is it not? You've just won a big award, haven't you? I can't remember. It's 4 now. What did you just win a big award for?
Journal of the Year. It was very privileged.
Oh, Editor of the Year. It was you. Well done. Congratulations. Anyway, it's been around since 1824, but some people think you've been the editor since 1824, which isn't quite true. You probably are the longest serving editor. And just to say, how did you get into this? So you go to Glasgow, and you're doing politics at Glasgow, and then you end up. I do like the fact, and then I'll hand over to you, that you had a mixture of jobs, and you came very, very close to being a piano player in a brothel. I read your CV as saying. How did you get out of that then?
Well, first of all, by not being a particularly good piano player. And so when I was young, I thought that I always thought that I was pretty gifted as a piano player. I play by ear, and all my friends said, "Oh, Fraser, it's amazing you play the piano." But if you're going to be a professional musician, you need to be off a standard, which is really quite off the scale, and I wasn't. And I deluded myself for a while, playing around in piano bars and things, and thinking I was going to do it professionally. But no, it was never really going to work. So I went to journalism, and went to journalism school, and I came up that normal route. And Andrew Neil, I met him at a party, and he invited me to leave the Times, where I was as a financial journalist, and come to the Scotsman. So I did that, and then when
wait, you mean you were at a party, and then the next thing you became political editor of the Scotsman? What kind of a party was that? What drugs were you all taking?
It was funny. It was, I mean, look, this actually does happen. I recruit people myself on a chance. On, you bump into people and you get chatting, and you say, look, why don't you come and do this? Why don't you come and do that? And at the time, I was a political correspondent for the Scotsman. Andrew said, sort of for the Times. Andrew said, well, why don't you come to the Scotsman? And I just did. I guess attracting the attention of somebody like Andrew Neil was flattering for me. I always felt I was a little bit too provincial to make it big at the Times, really. And Andrew seems to see in me something that I didn't see in myself. So I accepted his invitation to go from, a UK publication to a Scottish publication. and I've now worked with him for pretty much 20 years. I like to think I'm his longest surviving editor. I think he's fired all the other ones long before now.
It's a distinguished lineup. You should say what your relationship with Andrew is now in the Spectator
I should,
world.
right. I am Andrew is the chairman. So Andrew's the chairman of the Spectator. He runs the financial side of the company. I run the editorial side of the company as the editor. So he's my boss, and he's the one who asked me to become editor of the Spectator 12 years ago. A request which pretty much astonished everybody at the Spectator, and pretty much everybody in my family as well. Although I like to think I've proven him right in that faith, where our sales have doubled in a market that's down by 2/3. So I like to think he's got some repayment on that gamble he took.
And you're the most read political magazine in the House of Commons, aren't you, or something? I don't know
I
how
didn't
you know
that.
Yeah, I read that somewhere. Yeah, I think it came from you, but obviously not.
Well, no. To be honest, I think I vaguely remember there being an opinion poll asking MPs who they read, but we don't really care about that. So what we care about is how many people read us. And the Spectator is read by, in the room I'm sitting in here, we've got a picture of the Queen coming out of her helicopter with a copy of a Spectator. I love that. It arrived in the same week as I got a letter from a scaffolder who told me how much he liked the Spectator's podcasts and how much he got into the magazine and how much he enjoyed it. And I love
shocked with the
magazine for the Queen and
the shock to the Queen that I'm shocked that the Queen does product placements, Fraser.
She's shocked as well. She doesn't want us using that picture in our promotion, even though we'd love
to. Oh, really? Okay. All right. Fair enough. I should say one or two people are quite correctly pointing out, these are the epidemiologists amongst us, that you are not taking account of confounding between nations and things like that, but all of that's fine. I get the impression, are you writing a book on COVID? I mean, everyone else is. You seem to be getting more and more gemmed up on our kind of world. So is that the plan?
I guess every journalist has had to been sort of get a crash course in this. I'm not writing a book about it, although I am in talks to perhaps make a documentary about it.
Right.
And if I do that, I would love to be able to have a whole spectrum picture put together. It's my ambition to do a whole bunch of research and compare lots of countries and how the health service responded, not just to COVID. We're all aware of the COVID comparisons, but let's have a look at cancer care. Let's have a look at urgent diagnosis. Let's have a look at education. Let's have a look at grade inflation. You can already compare countries over this. And I just think there is so much to learn here, because it will not be long, I suspect, before we're right back in this situation. I mean, lockdown would be impossible to think of as a tool because we didn't have a technology a few years ago. We didn't have these PCR tests. We didn't have lateral flows. We could not have all worked from home with our laptops. So now the technology has made it possible. There's a hugely important question here to ask, is it desirable? And the risk is that everybody gets into their silos and everybody gets refuses to accept what they got wrong, and cognitive dissonance sets in. And I think there's a really important, I think journalism can play a role in trying to raise some of these questions. In my ideal world, there would be a royal commission that would properly take a full spectrum approach to lockdown, to policies, to whether it worked. Because we're already getting data coming in from all over the world. We can have a far more meaningful discussion than we could do a year or so ago. I mean, I got so much in COVID wrong. You showed me somebody who didn't. Even now, I think it's got the capacity to surprise us all. But now we've got the data, more rich data we've ever had before. We do have the opportunity to learn lessons, and I really hope we don't blow it. And I'd like to use my journalistic platform to shine whatever torch I'm able to on that particular area.
I mean, yeah. I mean, on that subject, it was something we haven't got much time now, but it was something I was going to touch on anyway. We've been talking about modelers, and probably the best known modeler is Neil Ferguson. But there's another Ferguson, Niall Ferguson, the historian, who, judging by the number of times you review his books, I think might be a mate of yours, actually. But his most recent book that you reviewed, and this is from your review, not him, and you're talking about viruses, and this is the quote, which I thought was extremely good. You're talking about, the advent of PCRs and things like that, which are not present in history, as the historian Ferguson is pointing out. And you say it's as if someone has just flicked a switch in a darkened room of viruses and allowed us to see this invisible enemy that we've been living with all along. Do you want to just extrapolate or expand on that a bit? Because it's a great phrase.
Yes, I think, well, we all know that we swim in a sea of viruses. The viruses predate mankind, and we've only come across them relatively recently. But technology gives us almost a crisis of awareness. So with COVID, we were able to track in real time just what it looks like when a virus starts to go around the world. Now, if you look at swine flu, by some estimates, swine flu infected a quarter of the world's population. We only know that in retrospect by serological studies. But if we'd seen it happening in real time, if social media had allowed us to do PCR tests for swine flu and track how every country was doing, it would have led to a far more panicked reaction, and it would have led to far more profound social consequences. So what we're looking at now is a crisis of awareness, really. This is why I think it's so important we discuss lockdown and learn the lessons now. Because we've now got the tools, not just to diagnose viruses, but to see how every country in the world is doing. And we can extrapolate graphs. We can imagine, as Neil Ferguson, the epidemiologist, wrongly did, that unless lockdown comes along to shoot it out from the sky, it will just keep on going ad infinitum. So we're hitting this epidemic of data, if you like, just puts a whole perspective on our understanding of the viruses that have always come at us as a species, and what, if anything, we can do to try to mitigate that. And of course, what we're not very good at doing now is tracking the side effects of lockdown, of isolation. What does it mean if a child from a working class family misses school for the best part of 2 years? What are the long-term effects of that? We haven't modeled that as well. Yeah. But when it comes to certainly the viral technology, I do think that the real-time tracking devices will be used very soon again for yet another pathogen. And we need to put this into perspective, which we have lacked hitherto.
No, fair point. And again, I do think it is absolutely true that we didn't model some of these other outcomes, which in the long term may be more devastating than the direct effects. People are still interested, as I am, about the trade of the journalist and the job of editor of the Spectator. And I just wanted to ask you then really to finish off on that. I mean, I'm trying to summarize. Some people have got criticisms of your stances on various topics. Now, most editors are reluctant to do anything other than always say that, always to protect everything you published. But are there things you published that you wished you hadn't, looking back?
Yes, almost every day. That's the honest answer to that. But
fair enough.
The editor of
You're going to tell me which?
But we've got a very important rule here. The editor is legally and personally responsible for every word written in the magazine. Now that's quite important. If something goes wrong, I get fired. That focuses the mind of the editor, and that's a great way of responsibility, really. So I'm not a great one. I mean, only recently have you had columnists getting sacked because the editor was shocked at what they wrote, right? I don't believe in that. I think if it goes in the magazine, then you as editor are responsible for that. You have your discussions before, you do the checks before. By the time it gets published, if it's that bad, then you as editor ought to get fired. To be honest, I'm amazed that I've survived 12 years into this job. I always thought I was walking into a landmine-rich environment here. But I do believe in the responsibility that editors must hold for everything in the publication. Even when we're doing, Spectator, we're doing podcasts, we're doing I'm hugely proud of almost all of it. Of course, there are slips. And there are some things that anger me, things I disagree with so much that I wish they hadn't been published. But this isn't the weekly Fraser Nelson. This is the Spectator. This is the oldest magazine, oldest weekly in the world. It's a magazine dedicated to diversity of opinion, stuff that will enrage the reader, will enrage the editor. But we are here to explore ideas, and we're here united in the belief that is by this testing of ideas that we find truth. And I think that is what the free press is all about. And to maintain that debate, I think, is a hugely important duty, and it's one that it's my job to discharge. And if I get it wrong, then it's every word of it on me.
Fair enough. I think I can guess what you're going to say now, but at the moment, Chris Mullin, who's actually my neighbour here in London, is defending himself and faces a threat of jail for refusing to disclose sources which are actually over 30 years old. Would you go to jail to protect a source?
Yes, absolutely. I think any journalist worth his salt should go to jail. There are lots of circumstances under which journalists would, risk going to jail rather than betray. The confidentiality is just so important in our profession. And by the way, it hardly ever happens. We were very lucky to live in a forgiving and a free society where judges do respect journalistic integrity. Only recently do you get when police forces go through journalist contacts and their phones, as has happened recently, it's tended to be a pretty much, it's an uproar. So while I would be prepared to do that, I'm very proud to live in a country where that is not a realistic possibility. I hope. We'll see what Boris has got planned for us next.
Yeah, fair enough. So various opinions. Some people obviously disagree strongly with certain things that have been published in Spectator on Islamophobia and other topics, but I think
I'd be really happy, by the way, if you want to give me the meanest question that's been sent to you, Simon, I'd be delighted to answer.
The meanest question, I'll tell you exactly what it is. It's from, I've just lost it now. Where are we? Here we are. Yeah, it's Arif Kajawa is saying that that you did publish an article, and he's put a quote in, which must be correct then. There is not nearly enough Islamophobia within the Tory party. I don't know if he's quoting you there. It doesn't sound like you. But
certainly not.
The journal. No, I didn't think that was the case. But anyway, we'll assume this was a direct quote from the Spectator. I mean, you shouldn't have published that, should you?
Well, of course, the quote itself sounds horrific, doesn't it? I mean, and I would regard myself. The Spectator go out of his way to publish moderate Muslim voices. We give a massive platform there. Now, the article in question was from Rod Liddle, who is not a great fan of organized religion. And by the way, as I was saying earlier, I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic. I completely respect people's right to have a problem with my religion, to have a problem with the way that we don't allow women priests, to have a problem with all sorts of aspects of it, and to say Catholicism is a malign force in society. I would really disagree with that, but I would also respect people's rights to say that. Now, in the article Rod Liddle was writing, he was talking about Islam's approach on homosexuality and Islam's approach on gender and gender equality, and was saying that he has got a problem with that. And he thinks that this is something that more people should have a problem with. Now, that critique could be applied certainly to many organized religions. And I don't think that any religion really should be above criticism and above scrutiny. I include my religion in that. And of course, one of the funny things about journalism now is you can take a phrase out of context, a sentence, put it over social media, and then make out as if the article was against Muslims. One of the funny things about Islamophobia is that the word can be taken sometimes by a group to actually being applied to even our Muslim writers. We've got a Muslim writer called Kanta Ahmed. She's a fantastic writer, but she's been accused of Islamophobia by the Muslim Council of Britain because she wrote a piece about veils, which they disagree with. So I think there is a big difference between having a problem with religion, which everyone is entitled to in a free society, and then bigotry, being disliking Muslims. That is bigotry out and out, as the same as disliking any minority. Yeah. I think it's dangerous to conflate the two, because criticism of religion, I think, is an important doctrine to uphold.
And indeed, criticism of Rod Liddle is also a very important thing to do as well. Definitely, many of us have a problem with him, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be publishing. That's fair enough. And so now we in fact have run out of time, and I don't want to keep you. So just stay there for 1 minute. I'm going to breakneck speed tell people everything that you need to come back to listen to. Our next in conversation is Sir Terence English on the 16th of March, who did our first British heart transplant. And we're actually going back to finally having a conversation with a real audience, which, wonderful though it is talking to you over Zoom is nothing like as good as when we have a real audience with us, which I know you and I agree totally. And this will be on the 20th of April with Angela Rippon. So put on your dancing shoes and come to the RSM. You can get tickets from our website. The medical theme continues. 16th of March will be our 99th COVID lunchtime. That's Heidi Larson on vaccine refusal. That will be good. 17th is assisted dying. That'll be serious. But our 100th episode of the whole series is on the 31st of March. I'm going to be interviewing Chris Whitty. JVT will be appearing for the first time on the series, as will a number of household names. I think probably Graham Medley will be there as well, and we'll try and get you in, Fraser. It'll be an extended episode. It is amazing to think it is 100 episodes since all this began. And all of this takes money. It's my boss. You have a boss. I have a boss too. Insist that I tell everyone. So please do be generous. Now then, Fraser, it's great to meet you. And most of the times when I do these interviews, I've begun by buying the person's latest book from Waterstones. And I've got a big pile of them. I can't say that I've read all of them, but I've had a look at most of them all the way through, or at least part of it. But you're not a great writer of books, of course, but you are a journalist. You've written over 3,000 pieces for Spectator. And so to do this, I took out your 1-month free subscription to the Spectator so I could read your archive. And as a thank you, and because I do really enjoy your writing, especially when I don't agree with you, I'm going to be renewing my subscription, as I never say in private eye, and will now become a Spectator reader. Because as I say, even when I don't agree with you, you are not boring. And that has been clearly the case today. So in these awful times, thank you very much for spending an hour with us. I know you're a busy man and I've got other things to do tonight. And so on behalf of all this, thank you very, very much for doing this. I've really enjoyed it. You're great company. And next time we'll get you on stage with a real audience who can put those difficult questions to you that you so enjoy dealing with. Thanks ever so. You've been great.
Well, thank you, Simon. It's a huge honor to be interviewed by you, and especially in front of such an audience. I hope I've been half worthy of your invitation.
Thank you. Good night. Good night to you, Fraser. Enjoy the evening, and good night to everybody. And some people are saying well done, by the way, which is our audience always say because they're very polite. All right. Take care and good night.
Bye.